So I asked Phil to start out by doing a brief reading from the book. And maybe you can just set us up with what story this is in the book.
Sure. So the book is a collection of 12 stories all told by different narrators in different jobs. As an infantryman, an artilleryman, adjutant, foreign service officer. This story is called Bodies, and it's told by mortuary affairs specialists, the Marines who are responsible for preparing the bodies of the dead to be sent home. For a long time, I was angry. I didn't want to talk about Iraq, so I wouldn't tell anybody I'd been. And if people knew, if they pressed, I'd tell them lies. There was this Haji corpse, I'd say, lying in the sun. It'd been there for days. It was swollen with gases. The eyes were sockets. And we had to clean it off the streets. Then I'd look at my audience and size them up and see if they wanted me to keep going. You'd be surprised how many do. That's what I did, I'd say. I collected remains. U.S. forces mostly, but sometimes insurgents. There are two ways to tell the story. Funny or sad. Guys like it funny with lots of gore and a grin on your face when you get to the end. Girls like it sad with a 1,000-yard stare out to the distance as you gaze on the horrors of war they can't quite see. Either way, it's the same story. This lieutenant colonel who's visiting the government center rolls up, sees two Marines maneuvering around a body bag, and decides he'll go show what a regular guy he is and help. As I tell the story, Lieutenant Colonel's a large, arrogant bear of a man with fresh-pressed camis and a short, tight mustache. He's got huge hands, I'd say. And he comes up to us and he says, "Here, Marine, let me help you with that." And without waiting for us to respond or warn him off, he reaches down and grabs the body bag. Then I describe how he launches up as though he's doing a clean and jerk. He was strong, I'll give him that, I'd say. But the bag rips on the edge of the truck's back gate, and the skin of the Haji tears with it, a big jagged tear through the stomach. Rotting blood and fluid and organs slide out like groceries through the bottom of a wet paper bag. Human soup hits him right in the face, running down his mustache. If I'm telling the story sad, I can stop there. If I'm telling it funny, though, there's one more crucial bit, which Corporal G had done when he told the story to me for the first time, back in 2004, before either of us had collected remains or knew what we were talking about. I don't know where G heard the story. "The colonel screamed like a bitch," G had said. And then he made a weird, high-pitched keening noise, deep in his throat, like a wheezing dog. This was to show us precisely how bitches scream when covered in rotting human fluids. If you get the noise right, you get a laugh. What I liked about the story was that even if it had happened, more or less, it was still total bullshit. After our deployment, there wasn't anybody, not even Corporal G, who talked about the remains that way. Some of the Mortuary Affairs Marines thought the spirits of the dead hung about the bodies. It creeped them out. You could feel it, they'd say, especially when you look at the faces. But it got to be more than that. Midway through deployment, guys started swearing they could feel spirits everywhere, not just around the bodies, and not just Marine dead. Sunni dead, Shia dead, Kurd dead, Christian dead, all the dead of all Iraq, even all the dead of all Iraqi history, the Akkadian Empire and the Mongols and the American invasion. I never felt any ghosts. Leave a body in the sun, the outer layer of skin detaches from the lower, and you feel it slide around in your hands. Leave a body in water, everything swells, and the skin feels waxy and thick, but it's recognizably human. That's all. Except for me and Corporal G, though. Everybody in Mortuary Affairs talked about ghosts. We never said any different.
One of the things that I really like about that portion of the book is that it gets at this idea that when you go through a challenging experience, war being a very challenging experience, you develop patterns and habits and protocols of how to talk about what you've been through. Maybe you feel pressure to talk about it in one way or another way. So you went through some of these experiences, Phil, and you came back and decided to write about it. And I would argue that there are also patterns and habits and protocols of trying to write about this subject. And maybe we could start out with you talking a little bit about, because you're such a literary guy, whether you felt pressure by those traditions and how you approached starting to write on this subject, which is very intimidating to write on, even for someone with your level of experience.
Well, I think there are all these kind of cultural notions about war that are so much in the culture that when I started writing about it, you don't really notice it until you see that you've just been regurgitating the ideas that we've heard before. And I think one of the things that was very important for me writing the book was reading a lot, talking to other veterans, interviewing other veterans, doing anything to complicate the notions of war that I had, because you don't just go over, have this intense kind of experience and then come back. You go over with all the stories about war that are rattling around in your head, and not just the stories about courage and heroism, but also the stories about how you go over and come back sadder and wiser and having looked into the heart of darkness, and it makes you a man, and war, war is hell, war is fun, war is all these other things. And then you experience whatever you experience, you try and find stories to actually reconcile that with the sense that you have of your own life. And then you come back to all the stories that people are telling about you, or about the experience and what it must mean. That narrator, he doesn't have the war stories that anybody would expect. He was a mortuary affairs specialist. But he does know different ways to get a reaction. And he uses that as a kind of mechanism for keeping people at a distance.
And did you feel like writing from a number of different points of view freed you from having to tell one definitive story, one definitive experience? Was that part of the draw to those stories?
It was definitely, important to me because, for one thing, I was a public affairs officer, so I interacted with a lot of different types of people while I was overseas, and there was clearly no one unifying experience, even for people doing the same job in the same place. I have two friends named Matt. They were both scouts in the cavalry. They both served in the exact same place. They worked with the same translator, an Iraqi guy who loved American rap music and was nicknamed Suge Knight. And but one of them was in Iraq in 2006, one of them was in Iraq in 2008, and they are totally different wars. And so if that's true for them, how true is it for a chaplain or an adjutant or an infantryman in different sections of the country? The other thing is there's this sort of, there's a tradition in war literature, the veteran coming and experiencing the truth of war and then coming back and testifying to it, right? And there's, in the First World War, Wilfred Owen addressing Dulce Decorum Master Jesse Pope, and Hemingway talking about, combat is the thing that only those who've been through it can know about. And I wanted not to have one, veteran coming back and testifying to the truth of the Iraq War narrative. I wanted 12 and 12 that didn't match up with each other.
I want to get back to that number 12. But first I wanted to say, one of my favorite paragraphs in the book that's gotten a lot of attention is this one, from a story called Psychological Operations. It's amazing how well the veteran mystique plays, even at a school like Amherst, where I'd have thought the kids would be smart enough to know better. There's an old joke, how many Vietnam vets does it take to screw in a light bulb? You wouldn't know, you weren't there. And that's really the game. Everyone assumed I'd had some soul-scarring encounter with the real, the harsh, unvarnished, violent world as it actually is, outside the bubble of America and academia, a sojourn to the heart of darkness that either destroys you or leaves you sadder and wiser. It's bullshit, of course. Is it bullshit? I think the voice of the narrator in this story has that story. But one of the things that's so artful about this collection is that Phil is able to, by employing a number of different voices and points of view, have a number of different people giving their different views on what a war means, what killing means. I mean, I'd love to know your thought in that, with that voice, if that's you.
He's learned something, but he's not really sure what it is yet, right? He's still inside the experience. He's still trying to puzzle it out. And, you know, I mean, I've talked about this before, the notion of war experience is incommunicable and sort of forever separating you from the rest of humanity is not something that I think is true or helpful. You know, I talked to one veteran who'd been through just a lot of very intense experiences, and he said, you know, people are always telling, well, I can never imagine what you've been through. And he said, it makes me angry when I hear that because, you know, what if it's important to me that you try to imagine it? And I think that...
That's kind of the empathy versus sympathy idea.
Yeah, very much so. There's the theologian John Edwards talks about pity as an emotion, and he's a essay on the nature of true virtue, and he doesn't consider pity to be an expression of true virtue. He doesn't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but he says, you know, pity addresses the suffering, not the individual in the whole. And he says something, you know, we might pity those who are suffering when yet we would be grieved to see them prosper, right? That it's a much more difficult thing to consider that, you know, somebody in their totality. And so taking that empathetic step to imagine the experience, which is not the same as abandoning a kind of critical stance, right? Not just accepting everything that the veteran might want to believe about what they've been through, because veterans are like everybody else. We lie to ourselves. And, you know, it's difficult to puzzle things out on your own. This is why, I mean, this is one of the many reasons why in the Catholic Church, like, you confess to a priest. You don't just do it to God. So it makes a big difference, that interaction with another human being.
So in your speech, when you won the National Book Award, you said, one of the things you said...
The priest up front is nodding. Thanks.
One of the things you said was, war is too strange to be processed alone. And do you feel like in writing this book, you've entered into a conversation that's part of trying to process this with other writers or other veterans? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Like, you set out to write the book for one reason, but now that it's out there and it has had this incredible success, do you feel more or less pressure about that conversation and that processing?
Well, the nice thing about it is that it's not really, you know, it's not just up to me. That I'm, you know, watching all the new books that are coming in that help you, that are just coming from different angles that I never wrote about. Elliot Ackerman just came out with Green on Blue, which is from the perspective of an Afghan boy turned, you know, fighter. There's some, you know, there's a War of the Encyclopedists about to come out, Chris Robinson and Gavin Covite, which was a book co-written by a civilian and a veteran. And I don't think it's just about veterans processing the experience, but civilians as well, right? That has to be a part of the conversation. This is not, you know, these are not wars that only happened for veterans. Mm-hmm. They're wars that we all had a role in, just for some of us, it was much easier to ignore that role. And, you know, I think there's an engaged civilian voice is just as important as the engaged veteran voice. It's essential, actually. And when I was writing this book, I had veteran readers who would call me out on my BS, but I also had civilian readers who would call me out on my BS, and it was often different types of BS. And they were both
What's
really...
an example of veteran BS?
Veteran BS. Oh, God. I mean, well, you know, one of the things that happens in the book, so there's a story, War Stories, and it's just a conversation between this civilian playwright who wants to write about the war and is interviewing this, you know, very seriously burned veteran, and it's told by the burned veteran's friend. And the woman keeps sort of projecting things onto the injured veteran. She's just kind of like, so, you know, you have PTSD, and he's like, no, I don't have PTSD, like, and you know, that's PTSD or whatever. She has her own projections, but at the same time, he's projecting onto the civilian all these negative things that he would like to believe about her because he'd like to dismiss her perspective. And those are both, you know, those are both bad. Those are both, you know, stumbling blocks to conversation. And the thing about his friend is that he's willing to engage in that despite the stumbling blocks, despite the things that send the narrator into a rage and a kind of defensive rage. He's willing to keep pushing and keep trying to make himself understood and engage with that other human being with an experience very unlike his own, but perhaps who might have something useful to say.
It's in that story that there's the exchange where one character says, I bet more Marines have joined the Corps because of Full Metal Jacket than because of any effing recruiting commercial. I don't know if I can say that word here. So, then because of any recruiting commercial, and the other character says, and that's an anti-war film, meaning Full Metal Jacket, and then the other character says, nothing's an anti-war film, there's no such thing. Do you agree with that? You want to extrapolate from that about anti-war novels a little bit, because we've talked. There's so much philosophy and rule out there about, you know, how you have to write about war and what a war book is and what an anti-war book is. And I wrote a book that was called both of those things. But when I read this line in this story, it made me think about if you had any conscious intent about saying something one way or the other.
If you're going to write about war, I mean, I don't think you should. I think the danger is writing something that makes people feel smugly complacent, whether that's anti-war or pro-war, whatever. Discussion of the past decade plus should make us all deeply uncomfortable. It should provoke a response in us when we think about what has happened. So our mutual friend Matt Gallagher wrote a memoir called Kaboom. Was telling me that he read a passage when he was on book tour. He read the same passage 2 nights in a row. I think the first night he was called a hippie, and the second night he was called a warmonger. I was like, all right. I think that in a strange way, I mean, there are war films that do a lot of really interesting things. I think there's always kind of the spectacle and the appeal of war is just very deep. In a strange way, I think that it's much easier to make an anti-war book of photography, where you sit with the image and oftentimes think a lot more about the human subject. But any work of art that produces a clear didactic message is probably not going to be very good because reality is not didactic. So in order to make a utterly appropriate, clearly messaged work of literature that appeals to the right political sympathies, whatever they are, will probably be a failing in some degree and won't capture the messiness of how humans actually behave.
Do you think people have tried to, by which I mean critics, have tried to extrapolate politics from these stories? Does that make you uncomfortable? Because I find, let me qualify that question a little bit. If you see writers writing on this subject and go out to talk about this subject, you often will see something very different than seeing a Jonathan Franzen or Zadie Smith go out and talk about their books, which is to say, you're often seeing the conversation immediately taken away from books and literature and framed as, because you're a veteran, we're going to place you in a certain position, and all we want to hear about is your view on the war, or your view on the Bush administration, or how do you place this book in a history of war novels. Instead of, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but instead of going in for a more maybe literary conversation, I don't know. So you almost have to arm yourself if you're writing on this subject, and certainly if you're as a veteran, to know that you're going to be framed as a mouthpiece for these wars.
I mean, that certainly happens. I think that it's not even entirely unfair, because I didn't write the book as solely a work of art that would kind of sort of exist in the ether away from the world of politics and human affairs. I wrote it because I came back from Iraq and I thought, what the hell was that? And why is there not a conversation about the things that I think are really important? I'm not even sure what they are yet, but I need to write the book in order to even figure that out. And so, I don't know whether the book is political or not. I think that it's clearly related to the political decisions that we make. And, I think sometimes when we talk about politics, it's, do I read this book and get a good sense that Donald Rumsfeld was an asshole? Well,
Get this guy on Rumsfeld, if you can later. It's a fascinating conversation. No, Phil is too humble to say this, but the President of the United States went on CNN and talked about this book and the impact that the book had on him. We had a little bit of an exchange about it after that happened. I think for any writer, that would be an incredible moment. But given the subject matter of the book, I was thinking to myself, would that make me feel like I could hang up my hat and my career? Or would it make me want to crawl under the covers and be afraid who's going to come into the room and ask me for my views? It's a tricky place to be in.
I think that thinking about what the end result, I'm not going to get the end result, but what our policies look like by the people who are enacting them on the ground, what that actually means is it's inherently political, but not necessarily in a I didn't write the book just because I wanted to have a sort of policy discussion of the Iraq War. I mean, there's a little bit of discussion of the policy in money as a weapon system, for example. But it's all about the situations that policy has created and how the characters have to navigate it, not...
Can you describe just in 2 minutes what is the story of money as a weapon system?
So it's a foreign service officer who's running a embedded provincial reconstruction team. And he comes in and he has these ideas that he's going to get this water treatment plant up and running, which proves to be difficult because the water treatment plant, despite us having sunk millions of dollars into it, is far, far away from being online. Even if it was online, the pipes that were built were at the water pressure is too intense, so it would explode all the plumbing in the region. Even if they fixed that, the ministry wouldn't, the pipes go across the highway to the Sunni section, so they wouldn't, the ministry would not be interested in providing services to Sunnis, and there's all kinds of complications that arise as he's trying to navigate through this. And at the same time, the mattress king of northern Kansas, who is an important constituent of a congressman, really wants him to teach Iraqis how to play baseball. And so he needs to at least give the semblance that he's doing something on that front, and he kind of gets taken in by this major who's running a civil affairs unit, who seems like the stupidest person he's ever met in his life, but actually proves somewhat pretty adept at navigating the insanity of the bureaucracy that they're in by just accepting it wholeheartedly.
Down to the blue and gray uniforms and a nod to the Civil War.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that story is incredibly funny, laugh out loud funny. And again, one thing you can do with a story collection that you can't necessarily do with a novel is really change the tone of the feeling of each story. So you can have a very dark comic story followed up by a very heartbreaking story. I wanted to read, and I definitely want to get to questions in time, but I wanted to read another paragraph. This is one of the last paragraphs from a story called Unless It's a Sucking Chest Wound. This can lead us into maybe talking a little bit about PTSD,
Sure.
or as we were saying earlier, maybe it will only in the future be referred to as PTS. So Phil writes, a gambin?
Agamben?
Agamben.
I don't know. I've only read the name.
Okay. Agamben speaks of the difference between men and animals, being that animals are enthralled to stimuli. Think a deer in the headlights. He describes experiments where scientists give a worker bee a source of nectar. As the bee imbibes, they cut away its abdomen so that instead of filling the bee up, the nectar falls out through the wound in a trickle that pours as fast as the bee drinks. You'd think the bee might change its behavior in response, but it doesn't. It keeps happily sucking away at the nectar and will continue indefinitely, enthralled by one stimulus, the presence of nectar, until released by another, the sensation of satiety. But that second stimulus never comes. The wound keeps the bee drinking until it finally starves. That's one of the very powerful images in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on with that bee and what can we learn from that bee?
The narrator is he was an adjutant. He's another one of the characters whose war stories don't quite match up with what your war stories are supposed to be, because he went to Iraq and he did paperwork. And he did paperwork for a unit that was doing heroic things, and and he's in law school, and he's trying to figure out what to do with his life. And in some ways, he's a broken idealist, right? He had these ambitions to be something greater, and he didn't really get what he wanted, and the big cause that he threw himself into was the Iraq War. And he's not really sure how to feel about it, and he certainly doesn't know how to feel about the Marine, one Marine in particular that he knows, who volunteered to go to Afghanistan because it was a hard fight, because he knew that people would have a difficult time, because he'd seen because one of his friends or mentors or his NCO had died saving his life, and he feels guilty about that. But he also knows how you have to recover and go out the next day despite wanting to grieve. And he thinks that he could, help people out in Afghanistan, and he goes and he dies fairly quickly. And the, adjutant went out and went to live in New York and is living this great life and doesn't know how to reconcile those sides of who he is. And the fact that he doesn't want to go to war again. And, his friends are advising him in different ways. And one of the guys tells him, like, you don't want to be the guy, bailing water out of a sinking boat. And he's like, yeah, I'm an Iraq vet. I've already been there. And so, but all the ideals that he believed in, everything that mattered, like, it's still very real to him, even though he can't bring himself to admit it. So what am I doing with the bee? I don't know.
So is the stimulant, but, and then we can move on, because I do want to ask about why there are 12 stories in this collection. Is the stimuli the experience of combat, or is the stimuli the experience of meaning?
It's meaning. It's meaning, I think, that he's hungry for, and that he hasn't been able to find.
Mm-hmm. So why are there 12 stories in this collection? This was not a setup. He didn't tell me to ask this.
I don't know.
Are there anything about that number that's meaningful? Sir? Father?
Very important.
I have not heard you ask this question, so if you've answered it, I do not know the answer, and I would like to know, because I think that people who write short story collections think very hard about these kinds of choices. And I think that this book is going to be remembered for a long time. And people will write about the fact that there were 12 stories. So I just wanted to take a minute on that.
It felt right.
It felt right. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. I don't know if we should open it to questions now, but does anyone, yes?
Okay, I'll start with, how did you find yourself in Iraq? Did you go over there planning to write about it, or did you were a big patriot? That you wanted to do this, or what was it?
I didn't go over planning to write about it. I mean, I always wrote. I wrote in high school, so if you'd asked me, I probably would have said, yeah, I'll probably end up writing about war. But I wasn't, like, if you told me in high school that I was going to join the military, I would not have believed you. It wasn't, I was never like a big military buff. I hadn't even read that much war literature until I went to college, and I had a teacher named Tom Slay, who's a fantastic poet, who's actually written really interesting things about Iraq in his latest book of poetry, Station Z. And he, said, like, all right, you're going overseas, so you need to read War and Peace and Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry and Celine's Journey to the End of the Night and David Jones and Princess.
What was on the list?
I read War and Peace and Red Cavalry, Journey to the End of the Night, Celine, David Jones and Princess, Hemingway short stories. And I read like all of Hemingway's short stories over one weekend, and I was writing these like Hemingway-esque emails to people, just spend the whole. Why I joined, how I ended up in Iraq was, we were at war, so I signed up to be a part of that. That was the thing that our country was doing. If I'd been born 10 years earlier, I probably would have done something else. My family's always had a huge respect for public service. My dad was in the Peace Corps, which is a little different from the Marine Corps. My mother's worked in international development for years and currently works for Children's Defense Fund, and her father was a career diplomat. And so, my mother grew up all over the world. I always admired my grandfather and my grandmother very much for that. And the huge project that our country was engaged in was Iraq. So if I wanted to hopefully be a part of that for the better, the military seemed like the best thing to do. And, there are all the other reasons that a 20-year-old joins the military. Like, it's exciting. It's, there's a great appeal to the Marine Corps ethos and the way that they present themselves. I was a boxer, a heavyweight boxer and a rugby player when I was in college, so the physical aspect didn't, appealed to me in a certain sense. But, a lot of reasons.
Yes.
I'll shout. I'm perfectly. Oh my God! Look at that, a microphone. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. My son is an infantry officer currently. He's about to leave the Marine Corps. Due to an injury during IOC, he just missed the opportunity to serve in combat, so far as he has told us. And what do you tell young people when they approach you or their parents approach you and say, what should I say to my son about joining, or my daughter, about joining the Marine Corps? How do you describe it now?
I'm proud to have been a Marine. I think it's a serious decision It's a serious decision generally made at a young age. So there's a lot of different pieces of it. But one of the things is when you sign, you're signing your life away for 4 years, at least. And the country as a whole gets to do what they would like with it, right? You don't sign up for a particular president or a particular policy. I served during George Bush and President Obama. Different leaders in some ways. And so one of the thoughts is what that aspect of service means to you, and then how your life might be used, right? I mean, it's in some ways it's an act of faith in the country to use your life well, and the country's not always done that with its service members, and that's a serious thing to think about. We need to have good and thoughtful and intelligent, humane people in the military, and we do. And we need to have people who are not just blindly obedient to the particular policy of the moment, and we do. And that's why it's about service. I have a friend who protested the Iraq War and then joined the Army, right? And then got sent to Afghanistan, right? Because you don't choose. So, but thinking about exactly what the kind of contract you're making with the American people is, and understanding that after you go over and you do whatever you're asked to, your service is probably going to be conflated with whatever particular mission you did. There's a unit that they're either going to go to Africa to fight Ebola, to help fight Ebola and handle logistical stuff there, or they were going to go to Guantanamo Bay. I imagine that depending on which deployment they do, they get a different response when they tell people what they did during their time in service. Now, if somebody says, you fought Ebola, that's great, you're a hero, that's scary, but that's a wonderful humanitarian thing. Part of what we're doing is we're congratulating ourselves for being a part of a nation that does that. If you get the opposite response to Guantanamo, well, part of what that person is doing is perhaps unknowingly castigating themselves for being a part of a nation that has done that. And yet, it's the same service member who could go to either place.
We have a friend called Michael Petrie who just wrote a book called Fives and 25s. He's a Marine, and he says that when people ask him, so did you kill anybody? Which is a question nobody likes to get, but he's honed his response, which is when people ask him, so did you kill anybody? He says, well, if I did, you paid me to do it.
And the other thing about the military is you meet a lot of incredible, insane, also sometimes terrible people, but for the most part, you meet a wide, swath of people. You interact with a lot of people outside your particular world. And I found it to be enlarging in that sense. There are a lot of things about the training that are great. You can also go to war and get killed, maimed, seriously psychologically damaged. So it's a complicated decision.
Yes.
One side to the other. Would our situation be different? Would your analysis be different? Would we be better off if we reinstituted the draft?
A lot of things would be different if we reinstituted the draft, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. I don't think we want to do that, and it seems like what we like to do is the other way around, not just use our all-volunteer military over and again, but drone program, kill capture mission, even a smaller percentage of the military, right? Boots on the ground is now a fairly toxic word in a lot of circles. So I think, we like to use military force, but we also want it to be cheap. And there are some serious problems with that.
We got the draft.
And part of the benefit of it being cheap is that you don't attract a lot of scrutiny. And which is why I think generally we need a lot more public engagement and political debate about how we're using our military and whether we have clear strategic ends.
Yes.
I was struck by your adjutant and the weight he felt when he was writing that citation. Was that you writing this book? Maybe there's.
Oh, God. I mean, you steal things from your own life. I'm not the adjutant. I
The
don't.
weight of telling that story for all those people, or telling these stories.
But I'm very certainly writing the book. I mean, I wrote with a kind of terror because I had like this sense of like, I don't have a right to tell these stories. I don't know even what the right to tell a story even means, really. I don't know if I even have the right to tell my own story, because everybody's story is the stories of all the people around them and the community they're a part of. So the only thing that I could do was try and be as emotionally honest, as rigorous as I could. And I had this kind of vision of all the veterans like waiting in a line to kick my ass if I screwed it up. So yeah, I mean some of that tension and yeah, I mean, in pieces, every character is me and none of them are, I guess is one way of putting it.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And I just put a couple cards on the table. I'm a Iraqi war vet, a generation ahead of you. And in the Anbar province as well, I had troops in Fallujah and Ramadi. I'm Iraqi war vet in Anbar province. Really appreciate the sensitivity with which you are talking about how this book came to be.
Thank you.
And about the images of perhaps photography over words in terms of bringing this to the fore. So I'm wondering if you did see it, if you had to be a reviewer, if you had anything you would share about Catherine Bigelow's production of The Hurt Locker.
Yeah. It's sort of hard to give you a film review. I saw the movie not long after somebody that I'd known was killed in IED, so it had I think a different kind of emotional reaction to it than I would had I not seen it at that time. There are things that are action movie stuff. There are pieces that felt very true, like the moment when there's a scene where the character comes back and he's in a supermarket and just at an utter loss. That felt, I think this is always something coming back from war to the society that sent you over and then wondering what the hell this place even is and what the values of that community are, what they look like once you've been over. There's we were talking about meaning earlier. One of the things is the kind of adrenaline junkie aspect of the military is very much emphasized in that. There's a bit in Sebastian Junger's book War where he talks about the unit that he's with, and he says that the time that they spent there in combat all the time, it's not when they felt the most alive, because that you can get skydiving. It's when they felt the most utilized. I think that's a piece of it, right? Being in a place where the stakes feel incredibly high, where it's no longer, these questions are no longer an abstraction, right? And it's not just sort of physical things like, for an infantryman on a patrol in Afghanistan, like tying your shoelaces correctly can have life or death consequences. not just for you, but for other people, but also the kind of moral stakes, right? There's a veteran of Vietnam who talks about units doing atrocities and why he didn't do that. And he said, there's some people who got into this mode where they could die any moment, so it didn't matter what they did. But the longer that I was there, the more that I felt it was the opposite, that because we could die at any moment, it mattered more what we did in that moment. And so I think that, the intensity of war experience can cut both ways. But, there's things, and the other thing in the Hurt Locker was the driving through a place and feeling very, very removed from the culture and the place that you're in, which I think was very good.
Yes.
If we could follow up on Ms. Carpenter's interesting aside about you and Donald Rumsfeld. Could we just talk a little bit about Donald Rumsfeld?
We have to wrap this up in half an hour. So I'm just teasing.
I mean, look. There's plenty of people to be angry at. He's just a particularly noxious one. There's a way in which it's not just. And to go back to the politics of the war, I think when people talk about something being political or political discussion of the war, they think it's like an either or, war good, war bad, right? Like, that's, should we have invaded in 2003 was like a question that people would like really want to debate with me before I went to Iraq in 2007. And I was like, that was a moot point when I signed the contract, like that happened in 2003. So it's a historically worthwhile argument to have, and it's pretty clear at this point. But for me, it was what do we do now, right? And one of the things that sometimes people would ask me what my parents thought of the war, and they have political opinions and strong ones, and you'd get a different take, I think, if you asked my mom or my dad. But if you asked my dad about the war in 2005 when I was joining up, I had an older brother in the Marine Corps already. My younger brother was in junior ROTC at the time. He's in the Army now. And, my father, he had his opinions about the sort of broad questions, but his big gripe was, why is Donald Rumsfeld still the Secretary of Defense? He's incompetent. It's very obvious that he's incompetent. And yet, there he is. And one of my things that I found very frustrating is the debate often happens on such an abstract level that we're no longer even talking about policy. Donald Rumsfeld had a book of leadership tips that he wrote out, and then was interviewed on Meet the Press and the Today Show with these jovial interviews. I know he's a good interviewee, but his arrogance and narcissism got Marines killed and made us less safe. And that matters if you actually care about the lives of troops and about what we're doing, and the lives of Iraqis for that matter. And so, I remember it was CPAC gave him a Defender of the Constitution Award in 2012, and it's the same group of people doing that are the ones who are arguing that the surge was a success and then Obama screwed it up. Plenty of things I'm not going to get into a whole politics discussion, and certainly the left is just as guilty of these kind of crimes, but you asked about Rumsfeld, so. You can like the surge and counterinsurgency and those sort of things and think that that was awesome. Or you can like Rumsfeld and think he's awesome. But you can't like them both at the same time unless you don't care about policy at all and you just care about whose team you're on. And if you care, and that's all you care about, you don't care about the lives of soldiers. No matter how much patriotic smoke you try and blow up people's asses. I feel like I should bash somebody on the left just to be
Yes,
even
sir.
handed.
Yes, sir.
Early on, you said that everybody has a role in war. Certainly that was true in World War II and the Vietnam War, where everybody was involved in one way or another. Can you describe what you think the role was of the American people during the Iraq War?
Depends on what point in the war, right? So in 2003, it was mid-70s approval ratings. I saw a poll recently that said I think 51% of people say they opposed the war in 2003. So I think now the role of the American people is pretending that it was all Bush's fault. No, I mean I think it's serious engagement with war policy and holding people accountable. That's our role, and I don't think I'm smart enough to know every policy decision that should be made. Certainly not. But I do feel very strongly that if we're engaged with what we're doing as a country, we're going to have a much better chance of actually having a military policy with coherent strategic ends. And the other piece of that is how we interact with the veterans in our communities, right? We're in the midst of the largest reintegration of veterans back into civilian life since Vietnam. How do you deal with and treat the veterans in your communities? What are our responsibilities toward them? That's also part of our civic engagement.
Yes.
At one point in my life, I worked on veterans policy at Congress. I also participated in some community service actions to show respect to veterans, to say how important what they were doing was and how much the American people cared. Reading your book, it made me feel like that civilians have a lot of respect for veterans, but the way they express it must seem ridiculous in a lot of veterans' eyes. So I guess my question is, how should we express our respect for what they do? And I don't know, I feel like everything I've done up until now must have seemed silly in their eyes. So
I don't think so. I think it's really about intent, right? And whether you're treating that person as a human being. There's an article in the Times about some veterans' frustrations with the phrase "thank you for your service," right? Personally, I've always been. I think it's a nice thing, right? Like it's certainly far better than a lot of people got after Vietnam. I think the fear is that that's where it ends. That it doesn't go forward, right? That it's an all-volunteer professional military, right? You have a lot of people who were very serious about the job they were doing. The end state mattered to them a lot and still does. And, I don't want to be told, hey, thank you for what you did over there defending our freedom or whatever. I don't want to be patronized. I want somebody to be engaged with the question. And so if it's thank you for your service or whatever way of reaching out to somebody, and then that's where it stops, then I think that's what's frustrating, is the indifference of American society to the wars, the perceived indifference. If, on the other hand, there's thank you for your service, or whatever phrase that starts the conversation, right, that is followed by an openness to the particulars of that individual, and doesn't seek to project a particular type of cultural or political understanding of what that war must mean on that person, then you're good. And that's true for any war, by the way. I interviewed a veteran of World War II who hates the notion of the greatest generation. I asked him, I was like, so what do you think? He was like, I'm not supposed to curse, right? He used a word that I'm not going to use to describe that trope. And he said, war ruined my life. I couldn't be with people. I was a loner after the war. It took me years to see that the world wasn't just an ugly place. And that was his war, the good war. The individual experience of war is always going to be individual. It's never going to perfectly match up with the generalized understanding of what particular narrative we've placed on the war. The one movie that defines the war for us, and then we don't have to think about it again, right? And so there's always going to be awkwardness between two people with different experiences, right? From different places, different, backgrounds, race, gender, but you have a conversation and you learn as part of a process, right? And the question is whether you're interested in that or whether it stops there.
Do you want to say anything just briefly about the Greatest Generation, since you've written a little bit about that?
I'm not bashing the Greatest Generation.
No,
but-
I think it has nothing to do with individuals and more to do with I think we do have a really clear idea around people who served in World War II, a similarly clear but different idea around people who served in Vietnam. I don't know if that same identity has evolved for veterans of these conflicts, but understanding the fallacy of some of those definitions is as important as honoring our veterans for their service. I think that's just what I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean, it's World War II was a war that should have been fought. It was also a nasty, awful war with a lot of really dark chapters. So I think it's a little dangerous when we indulge in too much myth making, and oftentimes it doesn't help. It doesn't serve the needs of the actual people who fought there.
Yes.
So wars have sort of a different character, kind of depending on when in the scheme of history they occur and what the political circumstances are. But Iraq and Afghanistan sort of grew out of the same set of circumstances, and they're so close in time. Do you think that, you mentioned Elliot Ackerman's book, do you see emerging a sort of distinction in the kind of literature that's coming out of both those experiences? And 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, will we talk about, that was a book about Afghanistan, and that's going to be different from a book that is written about Iraq?
It should be. I mean, one of the things that's complicated about it is that you've got the same group of people who are sometimes serving in both theaters, right? But yeah, they're different wars. I get an email from a friend who's in Afghanistan. He's like, yeah, Afghanistan is not like Iraq. Shouldn't have taken going there to learn that, but I think the literature will be. It's hard to actually predict what the literature is going to be. I think it's going to be really interesting. The thing that's exciting me about the novels that are coming out now is that there are all these things that that are new to me and so powerful in trying to think our way through the past decade plus, right? So yeah, I think yes, there will be very distinctly different novels about Afghanistan and Iraq, and there are already very distinctly different novels, even about the same wars, right? Iraq 2003 is not Iraq 2006, is not Iraq 2011.
So if Kevin Powers had served in Afghanistan, would he have written a very different kind of book from the Yellowbirds?
Maybe, but there's Kevin's sensibility, and then there's the war in question that informs it, right? So, Anna Karenina and War and Peace have a lot in common, despite, certain differences. It would have been a very different war processed by a very different mind, making very different types of observations about. Everybody's just writing about what it is to be a human being, right? So Georges Bernanos writing about what it's like to be a country priest. Shusaku Endo writing about what it's like to be a Japanese tourist in India, right? Like, radically different subject matter, but at the same time, not so different. And so, but yeah, I mean, it obviously would have been different, but I don't know how different, and it still would have had Kevin's eye.
Yes.
I'm going to bring it back to the book. Can you talk a little bit about how and why you came to the title of the book?
Sure. It's so. I mean, redeployment's a word in the military. When I came back from Iraq, I was being redeployed, right? And it's the first story of the book, which sets up a lot of the concerns for me, which is, it's not just war, but also what America is like when you get back. That's really important to me, that experience of redeployment and the place where you start to think about what the war's been, but also the notion of, sort of in a punning way, on deploying again. Because the thing about these wars is it's an all-volunteer military going time and time again. It's one of the weird things about being a vet is you get out and the wars are still going on and your friends are still going over. And you're living like a civilian life that's totally disconnected from the fact that we're a country at war. And how do you wrap your head around that? The book begins with a soldier or Marine redeploying. It ends with a corpse returning home. And yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of reasons that I picked it, but it felt right.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is in that first story, the sergeant is coming home and he sees his wife and she's holding a sign, and the sign says, "Welcome home, here's your chore list. 1, me. 2, repeat number 1. So it opens in this very, funny tone, and then the last pages of the book are just heartbreaking. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about a particular story in the book, OIF, because it's written in this military sort of jargon. Were you concerned that it would your readers who aren't familiar with the military would be confused by it because it's
that occurred to me,
or was it an intent?
Yes, it was very intentional, and actually the sort of confusion and alienation is important. I mean, I wanted that, and I should note that it's not just that civilians don't understand a lot of the acronyms in there. Vets don't understand a lot of the acronyms in there, because there's military culture as this big broad thing, but the military is like a big, complicated organization, like with a lot of different jobs. And they all have their own particular vocabulary. To throw some more acronyms at you, I sat in on the op order for OIF 06 TAC 08, and it was like a room full of lieutenant colonels and majors and master sergeants for all different shops, and it was literally just for hours them going down the thing, going does anybody know what this acronym means? Anybody? Send it back to the shop, have them write it out. Does anybody know what this acronym means? For 2 hours. So you've got your own little subcultures, and it was important to me to have that language in there. And I wanted, just at the level of somebody looking at the page and it just being dotted with all these acronyms, just the sight of it alone, just being okay, this is a different culture, and that expresses itself at the level of the language. And I wanted to look at the rhythms of that language, the way that it can be used to obscure things, and also the ways that it can be used to be emotive, right? Because acronyms in the military take on a meaning, if you say an IED to an Iraq or Afghan vet, that means something more emotive than improvised explosive device, right? it's its own word now, and the way that character uses the acronyms and the way that he, the way that they shift for him over the course of the story. And it's only 3 pages. I figured, I could make people suffer through. And I sent it out to civilian readers while I was working on it. I said, look, I know you're not going to know this, most of the words here. Can you understand the gist of the story without looking anything up? And yes.
It's a poem. It's like a prose poem.
And I didn't want people Googling it.
Yes.
Thank you. In 2002, 3, 4, I produced a radio series, documentaries called Experiencing War, and at that time, these were stories from vets, starting with World War I to Korea, Vietnam, up to the first Persian Gulf War. And there were a surprising amount of accounts, although everybody's was different, about how at the very end of it all, people fought for their buddies, not for their country. And I'm wondering if in the war since then, for a host of reasons, with different kinds of injuries, different kinds of technology, different kinds of communications where people can FaceTime with their families and other friends, whether that nature of buddiness is still as strong in veterans' minds as it was before.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Actually, Elliot Ackerman talks about this. He's talking about Elliot served in 5 tours and he was in the CIA, and he served in the Second Battle of Fallujah. And he talks about seeing people rush out into under gunfire, and Elliot himself is a Silver Star recipient. But he was saying, watching people do incredibly heroic things, his men doing incredibly heroic things, and thinking, what would make somebody do that? He said, courage is not an emotion. Like, you never feel brave, right? So what is the opposite of fear? It's love. It's love for people. And so as a leader, your job is to, train a group of men to love each other, and you actually end up falling in love with your men, and then you take them and you destroy the thing that you love. You put them in a situation where they can get hurt and shoot up and sometimes killed. That's the tension. One of the tensions that he felt as an officer. So yeah, it's very strong. People fight. They do heroic things. They fight in the moment for the people they love, but they make decisions that put them in that place, right? There are the kind of split-second decisions in a highly charged environment that you make, and then there are the decisions that you make prior to that. So, I knew a Marine who's had one of his close friends had died saving his life, and he chose to redeploy after having had that experience, after having had that experience and an experience in the way that kind of shreds the juvenile notions of glory and warfare that everybody kind of comes into the military with. And his choice to go over was a very deliberative one. And it's related to his feelings for fellow Marines, it's related to his patriotism for country. All those things do come into play. It's not that the broader cause is without meaning, but in the moment, what is overriding, I think, is oftentimes the strength of the unit and feeling that people have for one another.
Will you say what you said earlier, the Johnson quote?
Every man thinks meanly of himself for not having been a soldier.
Every man thinks meanly of himself for not having been a soldier. And then you went on to say...
Well, and also I think that it doesn't stop once you become a soldier, right? If you're a pogue, there are people who've been through more, suffered through more. Once people experience combat, it's not like that fills anything necessarily. There's always somebody who's done something harder there's always somebody who's died for their country. So it's not necessarily something that can be filled.
Yes.
I'm with an organization called Code of Support Foundation, and we work to connect veterans to the services they need. And so I'm wondering, as you talk to all the different individuals that you interviewed, and you said that all of them had very different experiences, how did you see their different experiences impacting them as they transitioned and attempted to, if you will, normalize into the civilian world, and the experiences and challenges they had, whether they be different or similar?
I mean, it's hard to say because there's a lot of different experiences. I think it's a strange adjustment. It's probably a strange adjustment leaving the military, even if you didn't go to war, just because it's such a different community with a different value system, right? Everybody is either on board in terms of what you're supposed to be as a Marine, or they're the guy who's like, screw the Marine Corps. But that's like a hallowed tradition of kind of Marine, who's defining himself against the culture, and then like you go out into the civilian world and it's like I don't know what this even is, and how do you find a new kind of sense of purpose, right? And people answer that in different ways.
I think we have to end there. One more question. Emily.
This is a quick one. I just wanted to go back to the imaginary line of Marines waiting to kick your ass.
Yes.
Did they, what's your reception been from people you served with or veterans? Or obviously not in general, you've probably gotten a lot of different reactions, but have you had any surprising reactions or disappointing ones? Or?
No one has kicked my ass.
They couldn't. He's a Marine.
I'm a runner, so It's actually been great. For the most part, it's been very positive. Not everybody, but it's strange. You get responses that you never expected. You get people coming out from other generations talking about their experiences, or what was similar or what was different from things that I wrote about in the book. One friend, we were talking earlier about the Samuel Johnson quote. I had a friend who's seen a lot of combat, right? And the story that he said spoke to him the most was the story that I wrote about an adjutant. So it's been really actually gratifying. To see not just to see what resonated with people, but also to actually start talking with people about the war and getting takes on what I've written, or even just stories that are only loosely related to it, that inform my own understanding of what I was trying to say in the first place, or what I didn't say, but what remains to be said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.